This is the golden question. Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to episode 22 of the Golden Question podcast. So far, we have done 22 of these podcasts, and it may not seem like a big number, but for me, it truly is. And I still consider myself a beginner. I feel like once I reach triple digit numbers, then I could officially consider myself a podcaster. But right now, I'm just a lone speaker on the internet. So again, share this, guys, with your friends. Share this with anybody who believes in God and holds conservative values, or somebody who believes in God and holds liberal values, or even someone who doesn't believe in God and holds liberal values. Because once you wake them to the idea of the free market, how it's the most efficient system, once you wake them up to the idea of limited government, right, what the Constitution has proposed, and then they accept that as the most truthful way to organize a society, then they could start looking into religion and what religion has to say, and then they could connect the dots. They could see that the two are connected. Anyways, let's go ahead and get to answering the question. Today, we're going to be answering how inflation creates wealth inequality. Again, for those who are familiar with this topic, this may sound very familiar, and they probably already know it. But again, this is mainly for beginners into economics, and a lot of the times you have conservatives or just your average run-of-the-mill Republican who believes in Trump, and they assume that the wealth gap is just a myth that's being promulgated by the left. And there is no such thing as the wealth gap, kind of like the pay gap between men and women. The wealth gap is just the same thing. It's just some socialist propaganda piece that tells people the capitalist system creates wealth inequality, and therefore we need to mitigate that by putting more socialism to try to equate everything. Now, there is part truth to that. The socialists today who are pointing out the problem of wealth inequality are actually pointing out a problem that does exist in society. Wealth inequality is something that you could observe. You could look at the statistics. You could look at the shrinking middle class. I mean, you cannot hide that data. You cannot hide those facts. And now when you point this out to, a Republican or a conservative, they might say, but it's all right. And then they try to argue for the inequality, and they try to defend the inequality that they observe. Again, I've said this in my previous podcast. If you haven't watched it, I think my last one was pretty long, and there's a lot of information that I packed in there. But a lot of the times, the government creates a problem and then comes in as a solution. The same thing could be said for this inequality, where the Fed's policies, the Fed's monetary policies, some that are passed by the Fed and some that are inherent just in the Fed's existence alone, creates this inequality via inflation. And I'll explain a little bit on that. But you can see how the government creates this problem, and then you have socialists who rightfully so point out the problem. It's just they don't understand the source of the problem, which I think is, again, separate from the problem itself, right? The problem that could be stated as separate, and it could be stated alone, is there's a lot of wealth inequality. We have a shrinking middle class. We have a shrinking rich class, or the wealthy class, but that's also increasing in wealth. So the size of the rich is decreasing, yet the amount of wealth they hold is increasing. And the size of the poor is increasing, and the amount of wealth they have is decreasing. And the size of the middle class is decreasing as well as their wealth. And I think that's the worst, right? Because the middle class is decreasing and the wealth they hold decreases. But again, the poor, the class of the poor increasing, that's also considered a bad thing. But that's the general problem outlined. So you have the problem, that's the problem, which everybody, or I'm sorry, the left, mostly the left and socialists point out, and they do it rightfully so. So they are correctly pointing out that problem. What they don't understand, or what they fail to understand, is the source of that problem. They think the source of that problem is capitalism, and they fail to understand that the system we have now is not capitalist at all. They think that the system we have now, and part of this problem is also from the right and from conservatives and Republicans who say that the system we have now is capitalist. The system that we have now is fine. But again, they completely mask and gloss over some obvious inherent flaws in the system that we have now. And I really don't know why they're defending it. I think it's because Trump's in office, right? Because Trump's in office, you have to defend the current state. And especially that now that he's going for re-election, you have to say that the economy that we have now is good, or else, you have to admit that Trump hasn't done anything, which he hasn't. So that's where a bit of the dishonesty comes from the right and from the right and from Republicans. So the source of the problem, the source of these variables that I've set out, the condition of inequality, wealth inequality, which are unarguable, right? It's painfully obvious, plainly obvious, and anybody could look at them. The statistics are out there. The source of the problem, believe it or not, is the Federal Reserve. It's the Federal Reserve creating inflation. And who does inflation benefit? Theoretically, or practically, inflation hurts everybody. But theoretically, it helps the rich. And it helps the government also. And this is where it gets dangerous, because given that we have a mixed economy, it creates this perfect storm where the rich and the government feed off each other. So what does inflation do, right? Inflation is the increase in prices. Now, some might say, well, isn't inflation in some areas of the economy good while in some areas bad? Yes, but only to a certain extent. The idea that you could own a house and your house could just appreciate without you doing nothing to it is false. And it's this idea that's being promulgated by both sides, that you could just own your house and your house just increases in value without you doing anything. Even if your house deteriorates and you don't keep up with the maintenance, the value of your house could still go up. And that's obviously a myth, because where's that value coming from? Are there actually people who value a house before you maintained it to after? Or, where does that value come from? Well, the value actually stayed the same. It's just that the currency that's being used to purchase the house decreases in value, which obviously you then require more dollars to buy that house. So your house cannot just appreciate, your house cannot just increase in value simply based on the fact that you hold it. And it's not really increasing in value. It's actually the currency, as I said, that's being used to purchase the house gets decreased in value, which obviously you then require more of that currency to purchase the house. So that's a myth that's being promulgated by everybody. And especially from the housing bubble's point of view, right? They try to sell you this idea that everybody needs a house. Your house can only appreciate, which makes it a no-brainer to go out and borrow money, because the amount that your house appreciates will more than cover the interest and the principal of that loan, which obviously creates a bubble. And not only does real estate increase, and again, when you look at inflation in terms of percentage, it's obviously more beneficial for you if you hold larger assets. So if I hold an apartment that's $5 million or $10 million, a 2% spike in inflation is much more greater than if I just owned, a $100,000 house or a $200,000 house. So the rich benefits greatly from inflation because it inflates their assets. And as I said, it's not only real estate, it's stocks, bonds, um, commercial real estate. You could even argue luxury items, luxury automobiles, luxury paintings, all these things which are very expensive that on a percentage level make a big difference when you factor in inflation. So the rich benefits a lot from inflation because they have expensive assets that the very definition why they're expensive is because they have a high price and they would do anything to keep those prices high. Not only does it affect their personal assets, but it also affects what they're trying to sell. They would prefer to sell you something at the highest price. I mean, the producer prefers to sell his goods at the highest price. The consumer prefers to buy it at the lowest price, so they have to meet somewhere in the middle. But inflation enables them to artificially increase the price of that good or service that they're producing you. So I think, but again, when you look at it more deeply, you realize that even though the price goes up, it still doesn't mean that people will be able to buy more. You'll be able to gain more from it because again, it's all relative. But the idea is inflation benefits the rich because they're able to increase their assets, and the whatever they get for their produce, the goods and services that they produce, they're theoretically going to get more money. So you can see how this, in a way, benefits the rich. And whatever assets that the rich buy, so like let's say the rich goes out and buys a new car or buys some food, those small expenses, even if those go up by 2%, it doesn't really make a difference because it more than makes up from the fact that they're highly valued assets also go up, which again more than make up for the increase in their daily goods. So let's say I'm a billionaire and I have a $1 million house. Now let's say my groceries cost me, let's say $200 a week. I would take that 2% inflation any day because although my groceries increase by 2%, that's nothing because it's more than made up for by the 2% increase in my real estate value. My real estate, my main asset in a way, my highly valued assets. And the rich have a larger portion of their assets that are highly valued as opposed to lower valued. So that inflation wipes out any of the extra gain they have in their expenses. So really, no matter how you look at it, inflation in regards to their personal stuff benefits them. But again, it's all relative because their gains that show up in those assets are just on paper, right? If they were to actually sell those assets, then you'll get into some trouble. And it's presumable that they have businesses of their own, and an increase in prices of goods and services in their business doesn't equate more sales. And obviously, they're going to have to pay their workers more to also reflect that inflation. So there's a lot of balancing forces, but the illusion is given that they're going to benefit from it because they have highly valued personal assets that inflate and can cover and wipe out all the losses and some minor gains in other assets and their other expenses. Now, how does inflation hurt the poor? Inflation hurts the poor by several reasons. First is their expenses. A poor person doesn't have that many assets by definition of their class, of course. So they don't have any assets that can appreciate. They only have expenses, and most of their assets are minor in value, so that inflation doesn't really affect their assets. And given that their income is not that great, the the expenses they have to make to buy food, to buy groceries, to buy your everyday goods and services goes up. It makes things more expensive for them. So that's the overall landscape of inflation. It benefits the rich and it hurts the poor. Now the poor have to pay more for goods and services, and they're you could talk about it more philosophical and psychological. Any hope for them to gain up that socioeconomic ladder gets crushed because now everything gets more expensive. There is no bargain, there is no deal that they could jump on and then benefit and ride the way up, because that bar, that level for them to hop on and to purchase some income producing assets get pushed up because of inflation. Now let's reflect a little bit back on the scale, on the demographics of who gets affected by inflation. So the rich, in this case, a lot of rich individuals who own the largest portion of assets, or the largest portion of high valued assets, they get benefited the most because, again, it's all on a percentage basis. 2% for a billionaire is much more beneficial than 2% for a millionaire. So as your inflation rate increases, or as inflation gets prolonged over the years and gets compounded, you could see what starts to happen. Those very, very rich individuals get compounded by that interest on their assets, and they just exponentially increase in value. And I put that in quotes because it's actually increasing in price. The value is still consistent. The value is still constant, excuse me. So you now get a more narrower and narrower portion of highly wealthy individuals, because the ones with the greatest portioned assets, the larger portion assets, the ones that are valued the most, get compounded, and it exponentially increases their value. And then compared to the lower richer class, the lower upper class, they're going to get compounded less. But it's obviously, as we know about compound interest, it's all exponential. So you could see how that gap starts to widen in that regard. Now, when that gap widens, I mean, prices are still increasing. So this lower upper class, this lower rich class, now has to start competing for goods and services, and they're going to start seeing that the gains in their assets slowly get the gains in their assets decrease relative to the increase in their expenses. And again, as I said, it's all compounded because it's every year, and even still, even if the interest rate is being consistent over the years, it could even increase over the years, which then compounds it even worse, right? So you have the lower upper class, which are seeing their gains in their assets getting diminished relative to their expenses. So now it might be even more expensive for them to buy a house, or to buy a car, or to buy some more other luxury goods. And even the price of, as I said, every regular day, your life goods that you need, your food, your water, your energy, those start to get increased, and at a faster rate, given that the upper middle class is now holding a larger portion of share on those assets. Now let's look at the middle class. The middle class now starts to shrink, right? Some of the people from the upper middle class get bumped down to the middle class, but a larger portion of the middle class is actually getting bumped down to the lower class. Now the middle class again suffers from most of this, but it's mostly their expenses that's going to be the major factor. The middle class does have some assets, but that's obviously not increasing at a favorable rate in comparison to their expenses. So their expenses now are going to start making up a bigger and bigger portion of their income. And then obviously they get bumped down to the lower class, which completely gets squandered. I mean, there's no way for the poor to survive for a long period of time without the need for government to come in and help them out, which is obviously, you you never just stay poor without government help. You either can go from the middle class to the lower class, and I mean, even you even need government now to get help supposedly in the middle class, which I would consider the middle class of today is not the middle class of 50 years ago, right? The middle class of 50 years ago is way, again, in relative terms, way more bumped up in the socioeconomic scale relative to today. So the middle class of today would be, or the upper middle class of today would be in comparison with, the lower middle class, or even the upper lower class of the socioeconomic level 50 years ago. But anyways, the lower class gets completely squashed out. I mean, they have to resort to government aid to facilitate some of their goods, and even their life goods, right? The ability to eat, have some lights, and live in a government house. Because first of all, they have no assets, and their expenses, obviously, which already make up a huge portion of their income, now just exceeds their income. And what are they left with? They either left to go and borrow some more money, and in that they're obviously paying interest because of the de facto interest rate of the inflation rate. So they're obviously going to pay some absurd interest amount, and which then just cycles and brings them further down the poverty chain. So you could see how it hurts the poor the most, the middle class in the middle, and it hurts the rich the least. And in fact, the only people that really gain in greater proportion is that top 1% or 2% of the rich class that gets to see their already overvalued assets quadruple and triple and convert fivefold, tenfold, 100-fold, whatever the inflation is, whatever it is compounded, and then that just completely masks any of the increases they have in their expenses, because obviously their expenses are not going to be as much as their assets, right? I can own a $20 million, $50 million house, but I'm never going to have that expense ever. I mean, my expenses might be $1 million or something like that, but I'm never going to expense as much as my assets. But the farther you go down the socioeconomic level, the more your expenses are in comparison to your assets. And in the case for the lower poor, their expenses completely bypass their income and their assets, which obviously resorts them to going into debt. So this is what inflation does. And I think I've made a case for it. You have it. It benefits the super, super rich, and it hurts the lowest class the most. So you can see how that line gets dragged out. Because it benefits the super rich the most, they get bumped up on the socioeconomic level. They become billionaires, they become trillionaires. And then the lower class, it's the same thing, but in complete reverse. They get bumped down at a much a faster rate, just as the same rate as the rich do. So that's what inflation does. Yes, it increases prices, but it also impoverishes people, because prices are both ways. People have assets and people have expenses. And if your assets increase, so do your expenses. And the beauty of the economy and the way it's set up, again, it's all the free market, it's all the invisible hand, it's all God's hand, the way I like to describe it, is it actually hurts you more because your expenses exponentially increase higher via inflation than your assets do. And it actually makes you worse off. It's not like everything gets raised, but you're still the same level. It's not just the same on a relative basis. You're actually worse off. And the way that the Fed now tries to get people to Well, I mean, it's it's in a minority, but the way the Fed gets you to accept inflation and gets you used to it is it tells you, first of all, I mean, it used to tell you it doesn't matter because it's all relative, right? Even though your expenses increase, so does your assets. So it's all relative. So it doesn't really, you don't have to worry about it. Obviously, that's not working out because we're seeing this inequality, this gap between the rich and the poor increase, and you're seeing people's income stay steady, not actually increase, and in fact, maybe they're decreasing, while as their expenses increase. So their income, in fact, contrary to this inflationary force, decreases, their expenses increase, and in fact, at a much faster rate than do their assets. But even if it increase at the same level, the poor don't have any assets to benefit from this inflation. So I think the moral is really what we see is that you can never gain something or pay for something or get expected to be paid for something that's higher than its value. And inflation is exactly what it means. It's the expansion of the money supply. And one of the effects of inflation is an increase in price. So if you have something, its value is determined by the market and the invisible hand, God's hand. So you can never think that you can get more than what your thing is valued for. And inflation, unfortunately, gives you the illusion that you're winning. It gives you the illusion that you're getting something for nothing. You're getting something above what it's actually worth. And that right there gives it away because it's actually worth lower than that inflated price or that increased in money supply, which trickles down to the price. That's sort of God's I don't know what you could call it. It's sort of God's way of correcting what happens because you can't get away with it. You could see that even though you inflate the prices of everything, it eventually comes crashing down. There ultimately is a correction because it cannot be sustainable to overpay for things that are beyond what they're actually worth. And that's the whole concept of inflation. You have a base level, which is obviously 0%, which that's where everything's true value is. And then you have inflation. Anything on top of that is just inflated. It's just artificial. It's fake. It's not what the free market determines the price. And I tie this back to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. He was approached by an individual, and this is a hadith. He was approached by an individual who was begging him to control prices, to lower the prices, to do something about a particular good that was rising in prices, or that was, it was definitely skyrocketing. The hadith doesn't say exactly what good it was, but we could assume it's, some good that was there, right? Some maybe it was a type of food, a date or some sort of grain or something, or wheat, who knows. And what does the Prophet reply back to him with? He says, I can do nothing. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he says, I can do nothing. And this I'm not paraphrasing, only Allah controls the prices. And what does that tell you? It tells you God ultimately, via the free market, via this indirect control of the market, God assigns things prices. And you could look at it also from a consciousness level. I don't know if that's a word. Yeah, I mean, consciousness is a word, but the level of consciousness where some people argue God is just a culmination of all our conscious minds. I mean, you could argue that, and that still makes relevant this idea of letting the market, via God's indirect control and God's indirect hand, assign prices. But you could also just make it, you could also say that God, through letting us be free, letting us use our minds to determine the price of things, we're sort of fulfilling our our duty of free will and the ability to make choices. And that's ultimately what distinguishes us from any other of God's creation, right? What distinguishes us from animals, from, um, you know, inorganic material, to even the angels themselves. They don't have the ability to make choices, to make decisions, and we do. And with our decisions, we can obviously do a lot of things. We can make inventions, we could debate ideas, and obviously, from an economics point, we can make choices, voluntary choices on what we want to purchase, where we want to assign value. And in that, we fulfill our God given ability of free choice, of the free will. And that coincides with the free market beautifully. And it's really, I mean, I'm surprised this hadith isn't um, even more well known than what it is now. And I'm surprised Adam Smith didn't mention this hadith, because he should have realized, wait a second, the Quran said hundreds of years ago that God controls prices. I came to a conclusion that this invisible hand controls prices. Now, I mean, I haven't really read a lot of Adam Smith's work. I haven't even read the Wealth of Nations in its entirety. So maybe he might have, included some mystic elements, maybe included God himself, but I'm only aware that he mentions it as this invisible hand, but he doesn't. I don't think he gets too religious on what this invisible hand is. But his conclusions correlate and coincide beautifully with what God has said. So inflation is you going out of your boundaries, you thinking you could value something higher than what it's already valued at. So that's why inflation from a philosophical point doesn't make sense, because obviously something is valued here, you cannot change the value of that thing. Unless you actually convince people to pay more for it and you alter it, right? You do something to make it more valuable, or it becomes more rare. So I think that those are the two ways to increase the value of something: either to improve it, to provide some additional benefits to that good or service, or if that good or service becomes rare. So obviously, the rarity of that good or service is out of your control. I mean, it's entirely up to God how rare that thing is. It's how much, partially, if it's how rare it is in terms of its abundance on earth from a raw materials point of view, but also people's willingness to produce that good and service. If I'm the only person willing to produce it, then it can have a base level value that's elevated above things that many people are willing to produce. But obviously, it doesn't mean that if I produce something that has no value and I'm the only one who made it, right? I'm the only one who made this ball with this crumpled up piece of paper, two sticks, right? It's the only one in the world. That obviously doesn't just automatically give value, because you also have to factor in the ease and the difficulty at which that thing is produced. So if it's easily replicable, then obviously the value of that gets decreased. So it all depends on the amount of effort you put into a good, how much I improve on that good, how much added value, that's obvious, but how much added abilities the good has, or the ability for the good to satisfy someone. So if I modify the good to better satisfy someone, if I increase the difficulty at which to make it, which coincidentally also makes the item more rare because it's harder to produce, and from a raw materials point of view, if the materials that I use are rare from that point of view, all those three things can help increase the value of something really, right? Not artificially, but in real terms, you could increase the value. But people who are lazy, people who don't want to go through the hardships of, extracting something rare from the earth, or working hard to improve on something, or increase in difficulty at which to improve it or to produce it. They just wanted to, they wanted to quote unquote increase the value, but they're actually just increasing the price. All they need to do is obviously increase the money in the money supply in circulation, and with that you have the central bank, which again I disagree with the concept of a central bank also. I do think that there should be no such thing as a central bank that determines the price. It's sort of like the Politburo in the USSR, right? It's sort of them determining where cash flow should go, where the money supply is, and they control the money supply. They control the value of things, whether they want it to be inflated or not. But ultimately, either they should just have it at 0%, right? Have interest rates at 0%, so nothing gets inflated, nothing gets deflated, or they should just step out, which obviously is the favorable position for them to just step out and let the market do its thing. So that's pretty much it. I've tried to lay out an argument against inflation and against it helping anybody. And in fact, it just widens the inequality gap, and it helps the super rich, and it helps the super rich in relative terms, because in the long term, it's still going to hurt them, because over time there's only going to be like a couple of individuals, right, who qualify as that super rich, and then right you can guess what happens next. They could just mingle with the government, and then right there you have yourself total government rule, because everybody else is impoverished and you just have a couple people left. But who knows? Maybe that's the goal, right? That's the goal of inflation. It just slowly deteriorates the economy, makes it less efficient, makes it less productive, increases costs so that nobody could afford anything and everybody could just look towards the government for aid and for help. So I hope you guys enjoyed, and as always, stay safe.